Welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski, and I am the community coordinator at the Stewardship Network. And I am happy to invite you to our July 2025 webcast. So first, a little bit about us for those that are not familiar. The Stewardship Network is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20 plus place-based TSN member communities across the Great Lakes and with emerging presences across the country. And many of our programs are open to all, and we are really excited to tell you about some of the work that we're doing and also celebrate one of our very favorite programs that just closed up recently. So our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize nature's caretakers. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper in the different aspects of that mission now. So we connect the specialized knowledge we've collected for TSN member communities, and we collect them from our vast our vast partner network, and we share it as widely as possible throughout our network. So we are really grateful for our connections to this on-the-ground work through member communities and through our partners, and we share that information as widely as possible, including through things like this webcast. We remove hurdles for TSN member communities and like-purposed allies so they can pour thousands of annual work hours into their ecosystems. And we mobilize through our TSN member communities and through the support of partners across the country. We seek to make collaborative stewardship accessible to everyone. So we'd like to dial in on that mobilize aspect of our mission real quick because, as I had mentioned previously, we just wrapped up with the Stewardship Network Spring Challenge. So this is the big reveal. Welcome all of you to this special introduction to this webcast where we celebrate all of the amazing work that we did together throughout this spring challenge. So we went from April 9th for the April webcast through June 30th of this year. And now I will tell you a little bit more about how we did. So this is just general background for folks that are not familiar, but really the main point of this is that we ask everybody to unite and we do more together. We want to document the great work that all of you are doing in your local native ecosystems, and we want to share that with the rest of the world. And we all feel like we're on the same team here doing stewardship in our various geographies, and this challenge really represents that. It is an amazing opportunity to celebrate stewardship and to bring people together for the sake of doing great work on the ground. So last year we set a really high bar. We had 58,906 total hours submitted, and that is an all-time high. That also included 13,521 participants and almost $2 million in work hour value poured into our local ecosystems. So that was amazing. And not going to lie, we knew that was going to be a high bar to try to reach for this year. We were fully expecting and anticipating that we might not be able to, but you got to try and you got to shoot for the stars. So we absolutely went for it. And now I am very excited to tell you about the results. So while we did not quite hit our mark for last year, we still had 56,805 total hours of stewardship reported, which is just 4% off from 2024. Still a remarkable accomplishment, and we are so proud and excited and grateful for everybody that participated in this program. We also had 18,228 total participants, which shattered a previous record, and year over year represented a 35% increase. So that is amazing, and we actually did break our record for that one. So we are very, very excited and grateful for all of the people that submitted and were a part of the challenge this year. Thank you very, very much. That adds another $2 million in work hour value poured into our local native ecosystem. So again, a very successful year despite not breaking our previous hour record, and we can always go for it next year. And we hope that you will join us in doing so. A little bit of background on the program in general. Since 2008, we have documented 462,259 total hours of stewardship. We have 70,750 total participants, and that's 13.5 million in work hour value poured into our local ecosystem. That is absolutely incredible. So now with that, I would love to talk about some of the winners of this year's challenge, as well as some honorable mentions for folks that were just there in the running. So first we have the Community Cup, which is awarded to the TSN member community reporting the most total stewardship hours. We are very excited to say the Huron Arbor Cluster has won this year's Community Cup. Congratulations to the Huron Arbor Cluster. Always one of our biggest submitters in the challenge, and we really, really appreciate you. We also want to give honorable mention to our second place Community Cup, the West Michigan Conservation Network. And in third place, we had the BCK SISMA. So congratulations to everybody that submitted to the challenge this year. Next, we have the Root Cup. This is awarded to the organization reporting the most total pounds of invasive plants removed. We are very excited to announce that the West Michigan Conservation Network has won it this year. There is always a big competition between West Michigan and Huron Arbor with this cup in particular. And so we congratulate West Michigan Conservation Network on their win. We also want to give honorable mention to second place Lake St. Clair SISMA, and also third place the Huron Arbor Cluster. So they were still in the running. And again, congratulations to everybody that was involved in that. Next, we have the Partner Cup. So we award this to the organization reporting the most total stewardship hours from outside the network family, meaning any partner, but not representing one of our member communities. So congratulations to Milwaukee Riverkeeper. We are so excited to tell you that you have won the Partner Cup this year. Really amazing showing from that organization this year, and they've been helping us out in recent years with the challenge. So thank you so much. And I want to share honorable mention to Alliance for the Great Lakes, which came in second place, and the Greening of Detroit, which came in third place. So in, Greening of Detroit in the city that I'm in now. So congratulations to them. So next, I would like to talk about the Inspiration Cup. So this is awarded to the organization with the most consistent reporting and submission of images that inspire us all. And it's a big part of what allows us to promote the Spring Challenge properly throughout the challenge. We encourage folks to submit early and often so that we can have more and more opportunities to share your stories. And the photos are amazing. They illustrate the work in a way that words and numbers cannot do justice. And we have to say that this award was kind of inspired by the winner of this award, which is the Lake St. Clair SISMA. So shout out to Amanda and her whole crew over there. But Lake St. Clair SISMA has been really amazing about submitting their Spring Challenge participation early and often throughout the challenge. And that includes a ton of great photos and great stories about their work. So we really, really appreciate that. And we encourage everybody else that submits to the challenge to do the same. I want to also, give honorable mention to Boone County Invasives Cooperative for second place in the Inspiration Cup. And third, we have Cake SISMA, another one of our member communities in Northwest Michigan. So thank you so much to everybody that participated, and congratulations to Lake St. Clair SISMA on this award. Next, we have the Solo Cup, awarded to the unaffiliated individual or family reporting the most total stewardship hours. We are very proud to announce that John and Susan Cross from, here in Michigan were the winners of this year's challenge. And we wanted to share a beautiful quote that they had shared with us that really illustrates kind of the importance of individuals contributing to these stewardship efforts. Local landowners in our area are interested in habitat restoration, and they're realizing that professionals can't shoulder this burden alone. Private citizens are key participants in stewardship of the earth. We're now on a mission to plant natives as often as possible, one garden or landscape at a time. So thank you so much to John and Susan for your participation, and congrats on winning the Solo Cup. And we also want to give honorable mention to Lindsay and to Shirley, who are our second and third place submitters for individuals in this year's Spring Challenge. So with that, congratulations to everybody. Congratulations to the Stewardship Network staff that poured so much time into processing the numbers. Rachel, thank you very much. Lisa, thank you for all of your work in getting submissions. Bob and all the promo. Lizzie and Aaron and all of your moral support through all of this. And thank you to everybody that participated in the challenge. This program would not work without you. And last but not least, I wanted to thank all of the folks that donated boost prizes to us this year. We are able to provide those boost incentives to submitters at the Spring Challenge because of the generosity of some of the partners that we have that help us make the Spring Challenge go. And so wanted to shout out those folks too, and thank you so very much for being a part of this important program. So with that, I would like to wrap up my Spring Challenge celebration and now introduce you to our speakers for today. So first we have Victor Bjelajac, who is the District Superintendent for North Coast Redwoods with California State Parks. And we have Shelana deSilva, Deputy District Superintendent of North Coast Redwoods with California State Parks. Today, they will be presenting their presentation, Change on the North Coast, Indigenous Partnership and Public Lands. So with that, I will stop sharing my slides and I will invite Shelana and Victor to join us. Hello.
Hello, folks.
Great. So I will now jump off and I'll let you two take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As Victor and I are wont to do, we're going to do this in a unique and perhaps unusual way. We thought it might be interesting to have a conversation and share a little bit about our work here on the North Coast with all of you in that format. So with that, Superintendent, I'm going to get started on these questions here.
Yeah,
so
thanks for in advance. Thanks for the Stewardship Network. Congratulations on all the folks doing good stewardship work out there. And we're part of Stewardship Network with California Landscape Stewardship Network since 2016. So thanks everybody for keeping these cohorts going.
Well said, boss. Yeah, thank you. I echo that. So one of the more visible aspects of North Coast Redwoods District work with tribes is the renaming of Sumay State Park, which was renamed in 2021. So Victor, what's in a name? Can you share with us why this park name change mattered to the Yurok people? And could you maybe talk a little bit as you answer that prompt about the process? Kind of what was our role as state parks in that?
Yep. So you may notice throughout this, I'll talk about agency stuff. I'll talk about, California government and what authorities we have in that. It may differ from, and also try and incorporate that NGO perspective, a conservation group perspective. What's in a name? So the name of this park before the name was reclaimed, it was an honorarium or honor essentially for someone who practiced genocide in this area against Indigenous people. When I first got here, I had elders in Indigenous community say you need to do something about that name and why are we honoring this person on public lands. Another aspect of that, I have a friend who's 90 years old and he talked about his mother and the way she thought about what places were called. And over at Sumay State Park now, or again, referred to, well, this is Sumay. This has always been Sumay. This is what we've always called this place. And gave an example, and I'll do it with Ann Arbor. Has it always been Ann Arbor? Ann Arbor is a name, it's a place. There are things associated with it. Now, if all the people were moved out of Ann Arbor, would Ann Arbor still be Ann Arbor? And that was the point, is that for thousands of years, people used a common name. There was a period of impact from Westerners, and that name was removed. And that name was then referred to where a person had a land grant. They were here for 2 years. They led raiding parties that killed people. And that was the name that stuck. So we were able to rename the park, reclaim the name of the park through our system, and I'll go into that briefly, as well as change the geologic point, the USGS point on topo maps. We'll no longer honor this person. So for us in state parks, there's lots of policies, there's lots of laws, there's authorities that are given. So I had people in the community come to me and say we should change that. So then it was my job to figure out what that might look like and what those mechanisms were. So we solicited local tribes, local Yurok tribes. There are 4 fairly recognized Yurok tribes in this region. And we asked for letters of support and did some historical research, identified what was going on in that period of time when the name was claimed by someone else. And I started with a letter from the Yurok tribe asking, identifying some of those historical impacts to Indigenous people and why should we have this name? And I said, that's very good questions. So looked at our process. So as a department, we have a director. We have lots of folks in that chain of command. We are also overseen by California State Park and Recreation Commission. So there's a group of commissioners that are appointed by the governor. They have the authority to change park names. So there are trail names, there are area names within parks that are different authorities. Director of Parks has authority to change some. Superintendents for parks are given a delegated authority to change some. So this one we had to go full process and bring it to the commission. There was also, when you think of a network and a network of networks, we had lots of groups that were supportive of that. So as we're going into the commission meeting, we had local Indigenous leader. We had chairman of a tribe, and we presented materials to the commission. We also came with 35 plus letters of support from tribes and organizations. We had over 1,000 letters or emails of support that went directly to the commission. And we presented materials, and commission took a vote, and 5-0 acknowledged that it wasn't the right name, and we were able to reclaim that name.
Thank you. There's so much in what you just shared in response to that question, Victor. I mean, I heard part of it is coming here as a new superintendent and really listening to the tribal members, tribal leaders, people who you started to build relationships with, but also knowing your own internal processes and what works, how to move a change like this through a government system, and as well garnering a ton of community support, which also requires kind of socializing the idea, bringing people along, helping people feel like they are part of the change. I heard all of that in what you shared.
And I would have loved to say that everybody supported 100%, but there were a minority that didn't like the idea. They liked what's been going on for the last or since 1928. They liked they were comfortable with that. But you have people that have a history of thousands of years in an area, and land ownership, that whole concept of land ownership and stewardship changed because of a Western force coming in here and doing some not good things.
Right.
So really, it was listening to those original stewards.
The original stewards. Yep. Well, I want to dig in a little bit on one piece of what you pointed to, which is the authorities and sort of processes that you use to make change. Can you talk a little bit about within state parks, within North Coast Redwoods District, within the state of California, what are the authorities that you point to that you kind of feel give you a strong foundation in order to make meaningful change, that meaningful changes that matter to local Indigenous communities?
So as a government entity, and kind of that philosophy. So when we look at our mission, it's a little longer than I'm going to do it, and I shortcut it. And my mission, our mission as parks, are to protect resources, cultural, natural, and to give people the opportunity to experience those. We've managed lands from a Western perspective for not thousands of years, 100+ years, where we protect land. And that concept is bolstered by laws, policies, practices, norms that are established. And a lot of folks in that Western thought think that you need to keep people out of these places. You need to identify these species that are in special places, and you need to protect them. You protect them by restricting access. Protect them by establishing policies. And then there are norms that develop from the folks that are doing that stuff. And one of the things that we look at from that Western perspective is we've got these special environments, they're unfettered, or they're impacted, or we identify what those impacts are and we're trying to undo those, but we protect it. And we don't want people going in there fiddling around with stuff. And if you think about that from a Indigenous perspective, and I'm reflecting what folks have shared with me, not, I don't have that background. But it's, stewards of this land. So what does stewardship from an Indigenous perspective look like? Is it restricting access? Is it excluding areas where you only do this or that activity? Or you disallow activities that people have practiced for a long time? This is one of those things that I'd like to talk about. a lot of time from a stewardship perspective, we say we're going to go back to the time of contact and go to a natural state, and we're going to protect that natural state. Really, on the West Coast over here in California, um, when Westerners showed up in mass in 1848, um, they were coming into an environment that had been stewarded for thousands of years. It isn't a pristine environment without the touch of human beings. Um, there were areas that were managed for game. There were areas that were managed for plants on their, riparian systems that were managed for fish. Just as a fish perspective, so Klamath River is one of those dominant rivers, runs all the way into Oregon. It starts at the mouth of Klamath right by Requa and the town of Klamath now. Every Andromenous fish that comes into the system goes through that mouth. Before contact, there were probably 7 or 8 tribes along that stretch of river, and they all managed fish and they managed eels and other sturgeon and other food sources. Um, and there was a managed system that was organized. There was enough fish for those folks in Oregon when you have Uruk right at the mouth, Nur, that could have just taken all of those. One of the first Western moves when Westerners started to get a foothold here was to put a fish cannery right at the mouth of the river. So what does that do for those folks up at Klamath Falls in Oregon? What does it do for those yields of fish? So you had a sophisticated system, social system, natural resource management system that allowed people to be able to sustain and exploit that resource for food that was stretched almost 500 miles. So a lot of times when we make these laws to keep people separated from the land, we have to look at why. I'll give you an example in that when I got here, I'm working with Indigenous folks, and that was based on establishing relationships and trust. But folks wanted to gather. They wanted to go out there and use those medicinal plants, those traditional cultural materials that they've always used, and through laws, policies, and practices, they were excluded from that for the entire history that state parks has been up here. We have mechanisms within government where we've pushed and gathering permits. And even when you, as an agency, say, yes, come and get a permit, you can gather. And then you say, what are you looking for? How many people are going to be there? How long are you going to be there? And what species is this? And then I want you to report in and report back. And I know a lot of aunties that say, ain't any of your business. So one of the practices we did early on when I got here was we were going to open this up to local Indigenous folks, tribes, to gather in our parks. And it wasn't just, a park. We've got 22 parks in North Coast Redwoods from Oregon border down to Laytonville. And we would issue permits for the district, and we would issue permits for traditional cultural materials. And that's made my natural resource managers' toes curl. And what I said at that point was when we have impacts, or we have overharvest, or we have anything that shows up that's impactful to our management system, we'll have a discussion. So that was 9 years ago, and we've had 0 discussions. Folks, Indigenous communities manage these plants for practical purposes. And it actually assists with that cultural revitalization that you have. So there are authorities that we use. I also have authorities to say yes. So a lot of times when you're working in government, it's easy to say no. It makes my job easier. When you say yes, you have to understand your policies and laws and authorities, and you utilize those for people, and you try and do good by people. The long and short of it is try and be a good human, be considerate of practices, cultural practices that you may not have been raised with. But I think with all of us, if we go back in our histories and lineage, you go back to that place where your feet were in the dirt and you think about what that looked like and what the values look like. We think of these things with authorities and laws, and we have rights. And a lot of Indigenous people I know on the North Coast talk about responsibilities, and they talk about that stewardship. They share things like, I know this land and this land knows me. So I don't make decisions that are going to impact this land, and always looking for balance. And that was a bit wordy, but
No,
hopefully,
that was perfect, because I love the story of the mouth of the Klamath and the systems thinking of the Nurtner coastal Yurok people that you brought up, because your own work looking at your own authorities, the state's authorities, what the tools in the toolbox are that you have, you were braiding your own sense of responsibility into that sort of agency framework. And that, I think, is the creative part of looking at, for example, the permitting system that exists for scientific research and how that can be adapted to be supportive of Indigenous community needs and desires for connection with their ancestral homeland. So you kind of spoke to this already a little bit in what you just shared, Victor, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the difference between protecting cultural and natural resources. And do you see a difference? You mentioned that Indigenous folks have shared with you that there is no difference necessarily for their worldview. What are your thoughts about how we protect cultural versus natural? And is there even a versus in there?
I think it goes to, and I'm sure that a lot of people that are listening to this, you've got practices. Think of your conservation networks. Think of that conservation ethos and what that looks like. And it may be whatever the geography is, whatever the landmass is, riparian area, wooded area, grasslands, whatever it may be. You've got a concept of what good practices are. We also have populations all over the US of Indigenous people, and their practices and norms are, they're not completely destroyed. I'll go into the not so pretty in California. There was, state law putting a price on Indigenous heads where they were actually killing people and making money. My office is at a place called Fort Humboldt State Historic Park. It was essentially a place where genocide emanated from, first by federal troops supporting local people that were impacted, Indigenous people, and then later by ranger groups, I call them vigilante groups, that based out of this place. So for those protecting cultural places and even having a conversation with Indigenous folks, if I stay at this fort and wait for folks to come to me, I'm not going to get many visitors. Just because of the history of this place, I have to be thoughtful and say, do you come to Fort Humboldt? And some people say no. So when you're looking at what those cultural practices are, there's a variety of them. There's that Western overlay, and with all the backgrounds of those Westerners that came here, you have to look at the history here for extraction, extracting gold, extracting timber. We've had that late green rush where you have a lot of people impacting forested areas to grow cannabis. So it's all about this extraction. It's not about balance. It's not about what the land needs, what animals need. And when you come from an Indigenous perspective up here, it's being a good steward. Everything is of equal value. And how do you keep that balance with all of those, feeding yourself and making a living and all that other stuff? Yeah, the short answer is no. Is there a difference between protecting cultural and natural resources? No, they're one and the same. There are different practices that get overlaid on landscapes and get overlaid on different geographic areas.
Yeah, I see that in the work that our cultural resources program here and our natural resources program here does in partnership. These are program managers who work really closely together and in that balancing act that you're describing, Victor. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that when you support the cultural practices of the original stewards of the landscape that we happen to be managing in this moment, right, by way of forced acculturation and genocide, when you support the cultural practices that help reconnect people to their ancestral homelands, you are inherently able to protect natural resources as well. There's a really beautiful synergy there. So I'm wondering if you can talk about your time, what you saw when you got here to North Coast Redwoods District now 9 years ago. What changed between the status quo that the tribes here were experiencing and your arrival as superintendent and all of these changes that you're describing to us?
Yep. Well, I think I came here with a good understanding of, what parks is about and what those practices look like. And I saw that there was a group up here that was disenfranchised from these public lands. I went into local communities and I volunteered, visibly go to events and empty trash cans and serve food and bring water to folks, whatever that may be, and go in a service mode. And it wasn't to do some performative act. It was because I wanted to do something useful and try and integrate with community and develop relationships in community. Um, it was powerful for Indigenous to see some guy, who's that guy over there, emptying the trash can. Well, that's the superintendent for state parks. No, and just being visible and going into community. Through that, I developed relationships with folks, and the norm previously, and I have to go into a bit of history with state parks for the last 40 plus years. Let's put that mark at 2015, 40 years before that. All of the top field leadership positions were occupied by state park peace officers. There was a superintendent series of 1 through 5. All peace officers have to have post training to even qualify to enter into the series. We did something in California State Parks called a transformation. We looked at what we had, we looked at personnel, we looked at classifications, and we created a couple of new ones. And those were District Superintendent 1 and 2, which opened up the top field leadership positions to professionals of every flavor. I think when you have folks with different backgrounds, you bring those with you. You still have the same laws and policies, but you have a different perspective. By opening up that series, it got people like me in the seat. And I wasn't looking everything at what is the protective laws that we have to keep people separated from land, but what are the needs of local communities? And what are those cultural beliefs associated with local communities? And how can we better foster that relationship with those local communities and land? So I think the perspective was, it's not, we've got these folks, they want to come in and rip things up and tear things up, and we have to protect these environments. 2, trusting people and welcoming these environments. Through that, we're able to learn. So think of where we are with fire practices, across the nation and especially in California. Fire was a tool. Fire was never something you suppress. It wasn't something that was bad. It was fire, and you use it to shape environments. And it was a tool in the toolbox that people used. One example of, cultural practices, Indigenous cultural practices, that now, after decades and decades of suppression to protect from fire, we're learning that we have these overgrown and overtreed forests, unhealthy environments. You come through in an old growth environment, you log everything out, you aerial seed or you seed with fir trees. It's an unnatural environment. You go from 40, 50 stems per acre to 1,500 to 2,000 stems per acre. And it's a changed environment. And it was changed because of extraction. With Stewardship Network and Redwood Rising here, we try and bring some of those older characteristics back and give, forests a jump start. But it really comes from those forests that we found at time of contact. That's the ideal that we're looking for. And those were managed places. So I really think the status quo is, I've got background in anthropology. I always looked at those folks that get hit by systems because of their ethnicity or country of origin or place of origin. I had a professor, got me when I was young in college, Japanese American, and interned when he was in 10th grade in Yakima, Washington. Came out of there, went to University of Washington, bachelor's, master's, PhD from Harvard, ended up at San Francisco State as a professor in a tumultuous time. 69, 67, 68, 69, 70. And you had a group of folks, ethnic folks, that wanted educations relative to them, taught to them by people that look like them. And first ethnic studies department in the United States was established, and this mentor that I had was the chair of that. So as a young person coming from a homogeneous environment racially, 30 miles away from Sacramento, I went into a college 65% non-European ethnic, and I was appalled. You know, I didn't know all of that history, but I had a man that I respected who the United States government put in a camp when he was in 10th grade and put his family in a camp. And I'm looking at these government mechanisms and how can you do that? You know, a lot of our work can be guided by trying to be a good human. And how do you treat humans well? How do you treat environments well? But so with that change in who has authority to manage these areas, you get different types of thought. I came in with my type of thought, and I saw a group that was wanted that contact with the land, was disenfranchised from that contact from the land through forced acculturation and genocide and lots of other things I could iterate through. And I wanted to open that up to folks and not tell folks how the land is important to them, but listen to what those things that people want, and then look at those mechanisms that excluded them from doing that, and then bringing them home. One of the things that's like, I don't like a guy that looks like me talking about indigenous practices. We have those first person narratives up in this district. That when folks come in to visit these areas, it's not me saying, this is really special because the Yurok did this, the Yurok did that. We have indigenous people in interpretive roles. We have indigenous people in roles that welcome people and educate people on what that looks like. We're able to enter into partnerships with tribes, managing visitor centers. Not where I go, this is the manual on how we do a visitor center. We have to have this, that, and the other, but giving full authority to another entity on public lands to tell their story. So I think it's really, status quo, no, can't, won't. And the change is what is it that you want to do? And then trying to figure out through the mechanisms of policy, law, and practices, how can you allow for that?
I so appreciate this response because you shared how your own worldview developed, and I think it's an invitation to all the stewardship practitioners who are tuning in today to think about, their own backgrounds. We should all be thinking about our own backgrounds, how our world views were informed, and then thinking, what is the action that we can take to align what we're seeing in front of us in terms of partnerships, how land is managed and stewarded, align that with our worldviews. So thank you, Victor. I want to end on this question for you, which is, what advice do you have for stewardship practitioners who are looking to build successful partnerships with local Indigenous communities?
We all have an education. We all have that way that we came up and those beliefs associated with that. If you want to build relationships with people, and especially in this area, especially with 3 largest tribes in California up here, especially with Indigenous people, is you got to take some lumps. So you don't come in and say, give me all your knowledge so I can do those things. But you say, what's going on? What are these things? What are you about? And what you're going to hear. And this is where you need to sit on your hands and you need to listen and sincerely listen. You're going to get people talking about an atrocious history of Western impact. And it can be a tribal government, it can be an individual, it can be a family, it can be a group of people. And they want you to be aware of this history that's impacted them and continues to impact them. That multi-generational trauma that comes from these atrocious events. And so you'll have people that will say, government sucks, you suck. I've got a uniform when I'm working with Indigenous groups or going to a government-to-government meeting. I don't wear a uniform. If I come in with all the decorations, it is impactful to people and it makes them feel a certain way. And it isn't open and welcoming. It's once again, here's this authority, a government authority, coming in telling me what needs to happen. So you come as a regular person and you listen to people. And when you build trust with people by listening and not saying, this is what we're going to do, we've thought about this for you, we're going to do this for you, and you just listen and figure out what those things are that people want. And then how do you make that happen? And I think that's a challenge. It's you have to go in and listen. You have to be of service. It's not about your agenda. And this is what I found is that when you, and this is one of those other practices that helps, your organization as a whole, you've got authority figures in there. You have elected members. You have folks that represent, that say words for an organization. If those words from the top of the organization and other organizations, their leadership, if they're saying we need to listen and do this, and you start modeling a behavior where you're not coming in and dictating what happens, but listening and then trying to move things to support communities. Your folks that you work with see that as well. So this is something from, coming where everything is precious. Nothing should be manipulated by people unless it goes through my system of laws and policies. To we're listening to folks. We're going to give folks opportunity to come into our parks. This is how taking that approach after a couple of years, we have junior, foresters and other folks out in the field when they're doing surveys, they're noticing plants that are important for traditional cultural practices. And I've had young people come to me and say, hey, is it okay if I drop a pin on this patch of hazel? Or there's a bunch of iris over here. Is it okay if I identify that? So that's something that's happened organically through the organization, nobody directed to do anything, but seeing that they're Indigenous folks, these are traditional materials that are continuing cultural revitalization, and they're asking if they can identify those for Indigenous folks. So another thing that's helped us here in California, 2019, our governor did an apology for genocide that happened in California, government-sponsored genocide for forced acculturation. Acknowledged that and came up with an executive order that invited agencies to help folks and have better relationships with Indigenous folks, enter into partnerships. So that's a top leadership from the state. I'm, down that chain of ways, but that gives me the authority to start looking at our practices. So one of those things that we did was gathering permits. We would make people do that. We now have MOUs in place with several tribes where tribal members show an ID and come into a park and do what they need to do. The point of it is you model good behavior and folks start to adopt it.
Yeah, I think what's so important about what you're sharing right there, Victor, is that by creating the change that needs to happen here at the district level, it is true that we can influence the systems of power above us. And I think today that's a really hopeful message. I also heard you say in terms of advice, be approachable, be a good listener, show up. And show up with an open mind and an open heart. Don't come with a baked concept for everybody. Hear what folks need, hear what the community needs. Thank you so much, Victor. I'm going to share my screen now, and I want to try to distill a little bit of what Victor shared so that we have some tips, if you will, for folks. Hopefully you can see my screen. So when we're working together with Indigenous communities, as you probably heard in everything that Victor shared this afternoon, there are a lot of steps along the way that need to be taken. It's not linear. You step a few steps forward, you go a little bit back, you go around, you keep going, right? I think that's the main thing. So Victor and I wanted to make sure that we wrap up this conversation with some really tangible steps that all of you can take into your work, hopefully to support you. We've all heard this statement before, budgets are values statements. So in order for Victor to do the work he describes, he has to use resources that are available to him. So, one of the things we wanted to share with all of you is that When you think about partnerships with Indigenous communities and your local tribes, make sure you're planning for next year's budget to put a little bit of money aside for honoraria or stipends for tribal participation, to pay your staff to do the work that they need to do to be out there with community, learning from them. This work doesn't happen without support. So make sure your budget reflects your goals for engaging with tribes. Next, every place, every tribe, and every project you're working on, even with a tribe that you've been working with, is different. So come with your beginner's mindset and understand that the process, the conversation, the pathway that has worked for you in one instance might not work in another instance, in another location or with another tribe. So just be open to adapting. Be ready for that. We heard Victor speak to this. Understand your authorities and your limitations. Know what the tools are in the toolbox. Do you have a governor officially apologizing to tribes and directing you to enter into memorandums of understanding with them? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But I'm sure at every local, state, regional level, there are some authorities that would be supportive of you. And if there aren't, think about what you need to create, and also understand your limitations so that you know when you're getting creative with policies that you're still adhering to laws and regulations, and that's just going to support you in sustaining your work going forward. And then we definitely heard this in what Victor shared. Learn, learn, learn. Have your listening ears open. You know, don't assume that the worldview you bring to a moment of engagement is the worldview that's functioning for the people you're partnering with. And with that, I think we're ready to open it up to questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you again, Victor, and congratulations to all the landscape stewards out there who did such amazing work this spring. Sorry, go ahead, Victor.
And I was just going to say, you can think of it as characterize it as extra work, and it's all of this extra stuff. It's really an enrichment. It's a life enrichment. As professionals, you're doing lots of stuff out there in the landscape, and it's an additive. There's nothing subtracted by engaging.
Good point, Don. Thanks.
Thank you both so very much. Really stimulating and interesting conversation. We have a few questions from the audience that I'd love to share with you both, if that's okay. So one of the questions was, how do you or your district approach working with various tribes who may have different views and needs? So how do you kind of balance not only your, engagement with tribal voices, but also how those relationships impact one another?
So managing relationships between tribes is none of my business. So as a public, entity, public land steward, I try and give people equal access to stuff. What people are looking for, it's rarely the exact same thing. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's access to resources. I'll give an example. Up here, we have old growth redwoods. 50% of all that exist in the world are in this district. Precious, and it's precious to communities up here because of the traditional cultural practices. One of those is canoe making. So there had been no logs coming out of state parks for a long time. We don't go out and log old growth for whatever practice. But when we have windfall and those logs go across roads, we have to cut sections out of those. In the past, we would stockpile those and make split rail and decking and other things. We started opening that up to Indigenous community. Right now, over the last years, there's over 12 canoes that have either participated in, traditional cultural practices, and numerous have already participated in ceremony. So that's a resource that Indigenous folks in this area always had available to them, that's now available to them again, and it's done nothing but enrich that revitalization of culture.
I think I would just add that, this is such a challenge, right? Because you want to do good work with one tribal entity, and that might be in conflict with another tribal entity in your region or where you are. How do you navigate that? And, to Victor's point, I think it's really it's not our business as a government agency, or I would even argue as a nonprofit that's not an Indigenous focused nonprofit, to try to mediate or mitigate. The best thing we can do is just be really honest about what we're working on. So if one tribe says to us, well, I want to see the MOU you worked on with this other tribe, I can't show you that, but I can tell you I am working on an agreement with them. What do you want to see happen? What agreement can we make happen with you? So it's really just about being really clear, and honest about what you're working on, and letting folks work out their differences themselves rather than trying to get in the middle.
Yeah, no paternalism.
That's right.
No, that makes sense. And so it's less about, as you said, mediating between these different interests and more about trying to have these various interests all informing your work and priorities and being honest about that process of evaluation. Because
Yeah,
you can't prevent the conflict like you couldn't prevent any different interest of a different, community group that has, different opinions on how to do things. But you can just be honest about your processes. So yeah, that's very a great lesson, I think, for all of us. I'd also like to ask a quick question, then we have one more for you about kind of what you're looking forward to in the future. But in terms of another one of these kind of balancing questions, so are there ever times where some of the cultural preservation that you're trying to do could be at odds with certain priorities on the environmental conservation? I know that you said oftentimes they're additive to one another, and I think that's the ideal situation when they are. But I'm curious if there are ever times where you have to kind of mediate again, the wrong word, but to balance those priorities of course respecting cultural practices and allowing access and those types of things, and then also from a management perspective, how do you balance those priorities?
That's what you do, is you balance priorities. What I've found, and we've got 14 federally recognized tribes, another 5 that are listed with Native American Heritage Commission in California, as well as other unrecognized Indigenous people and Indigenous tribes. And it's I just lost my train of thought. Say it again quickly. Sorry.
Oh, just the balance between prioritization of cultural,
Right.
conservation
And that's where people,
yeah.
a lot of time you'll look at it and people want to make that contrast: protection of natural resources and protection of cultural resources. If you look at those as the same thing, our Western practices are just worldviews. Indigenous practices are worldviews. Do they come into conflict? California has 40 million people. If I allowed everybody in California to come into one park and do whatever they want, that's not good stewardship. But when you have people who are from an area and we're stewards of this area and have ideals and worldviews that coincide with what we think of as these natural environments, you support that. I don't see them in conflict. And today, when we look at getting these environments back to where they were, we're talking about undoing the impacts from Western civilization coming here. So I don't see a conflict, and they're really one and the same. Now, when you look at the 40 million, you can't give everybody the same rights. And this is a conversation I've had many times with people. Why do these Indigenous people get to do this, that, and the other? And I say, well, in California, first 2 governors paid immigrants to kill Indigenous people. Indigenous people were punished for speaking their language, for practicing their culture. Children were separated from families and isolated and told everything Indigenous that they do is wrong. Your religion is wrong, your practices are wrong, the way you dress is wrong, the way you have your hair is wrong. And then those folks that were impacted by that came back into communities with those ideals. So when you have that background, I will give you access. And a lot of times, halfway through that, a head starts to go down, the combative posture goes away, and they go, oh, okay, I get it.
I think what you're pointing to, Victor, is the trust relationship. If land stewards are worried about cultural practices being in conflict with natural resource protection goals, what is the trust relationship that you have with the tribe who's asking for that access or that practice to happen. When we
I
build
was,
those relationships and we take time to build those relationships, I think we have not experienced these being in conflict because of that relationship.
but think
Rob, I know
about
you have
some,
one more question, right?
Oh, sorry, Victor, did you want to say something more?
no, I was going to say, think about what those ideals are. We've got, botanical organizations in California that have done great things for identifying species, protecting species, lots of other stuff. And I get in front of that kind of group and I say, you know what? Indigenous people come here. I don't ask them what they're doing. They harvest what they want. And when we have problems, we'll deal with it. I haven't had problems, but think about that from a Western perspective. We're the scientists. We know what's best for these. Well, there are people that have lived on this land for thousands of years, and maybe they have some practices that are beneficial. And we allow people to practice their culture on these landscapes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is really great. I'm the intersection and the challenges are some of the most interesting parts of this, and it's really impressive and inspiring to hear about how you all navigate just the way to implement these things and have a real on the ground impact. So thank you so very much. The last question I wanted to ask you just briefly, is there anything on the horizon that you're really excited about in terms of your engagement with Indigenous communities? Anything that you've worked on recently that maybe you didn't talk about today, or anything that's on the horizon that you're looking forward to?
We think about, public land managers. We have practices, and let's take fire as one of those practices. And if you look at prescribed burns, we're reducing fuel loads. We light things off at the bottom, we stop it at the top, and fire just kind of runs up. There's a local group, Europe Cultural Fire Management Council, that have cultural burns. It's different. It's for purpose burns, high intensity, low intensity, mosaic on a landscape. We actually have an engine going over up by Witchpeck tomorrow, which is inland, on Yurok lands, working with these cultural stewards doing cultural burns. And the advantage is we now have agency folks that go over there and see that practice. Then when we come back on these public lands, there's a different perspective of what are these plants? What is the purpose? Is it fuel load reduction? That's one thing. Is it just making fire breaks where it's only going to stay in a certain area? But now when you think about culturally, what does fire do as a tool? How can it enhance this or that plant environment or environment for animals or whatever that looks like? So now we have folks that are trained in a Western school, getting in touch of a different way of thinking and sharing those practices. So we'll send folks inland working with Indigenous fire crews, and they also send folks our way. So it's informing. And I think that, with the government entity learning these practices, it's not taking them, but it's starting to incorporate those and not incorporating them as solos. We got the knowledge, we're doing it, but inviting Indigenous community also to participate in our stewardship of these lands.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. Thank you again to Victor and Shelana for a wonderful discussion. I will just very briefly share some outro slides for us for the Stewardship Network. So just wanted to encourage everybody to become a regular if you are available for these monthly webcasts. We do these every second Wednesday of the month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. So we would love for you to visit stewardshipnetwork.org/webcast and learn more about what we have coming up. A few that we have coming up recently, or in the short term, is Ecology of Red-Headed Woodpeckers in a Threatened Ecosystem: Insights from a Long-Term Investigation in Oak Savannas with Elena West of University of Minnesota Twin Cities. That is happening in August of 2025. And then in September of 2025, we have Urban Sanctuaries: Greening Faith Spaces and Climate Justice with Tiffany Jones of the National Wildlife Federation. So with that, thank you all so much online for those that tuned in. We appreciate you and all of your questions and your insights. And once again, thank you to Shelana and Victor for taking time with us today.